Someone apparently asked Sid Vicious if punk rock was the music of the man in the street, and he says, no, I've met the man in the street and he's a cunt. In the early to mid 1980s, people didn't really say things like indie kids, and we certainly weren't punk rockers.
It was Glasgow's own particular take on punk, and it was effeminate.
If you wanted to be a musician or an artist, you were laughed at. You were just like, who do you think you are?
A lot of people realised that they had an alternative, you know, that they could do something else, they could follow their dreams.
And then Splash One appeared. It made you realise there's other people out there that want the same kind of things, that understand the same kind of things. So to be honest, you're not really that fucked up in the head as you thought you were. Glasgow's a city of that grey area of things that have kind of merged together, tastes that have merged together, influences. Splash One was run by 8 people. They just got together and decided to put a party on every 2 weeks, which I think it was. There was no DJ, all the music was presented on cassettes made by the people that ran it. There was always bands playing as well as the music. You know, then bands from Glasgow like the Pastels and Primal Scream, ourselves, the BMX Bandits. I played there 3 times actually. I played twice with the Soup Dragons, once with BMX Bandits. You know, not just bands from Glasgow. It was like the Loft, Felt, Sonic Youth played there as well. And it introduced me personally to lots of things that were huge influences.
When I think about Splash One, I think of all the bands that came after it. I mean, a whole scene grew up here that I don't think really existed before. I think Splash One was definitely, you know, a starting point. It was probably the first time a lot of people with similar thoughts were together in the same space. Splash One developed a cult status without the mediation of the media. It wasn't really recorded, it wasn't photographed. There's no website about Splash One, there are no books about Splash One. It's almost like a folk cultural myth. It's something that simply kind of exists in the fabric of the scene, and there are these people who remain who still now and then will talk about it and how important it was.
Instead of nothing much happening, why not try a Splash One happening? Run once a month on Sunday evenings by 8 people we shall perceive as the guardians of the psychedelic punk rock realism. You'll be exposed to near fatal doses of obscurism and self-indulgence. It will last until we lose interest. We are anonymous. We are not mercenary, not polite, but honest. Another music in a different setting.
Around about the mid-80s, it was the first time that people really got together to talk about pop music as history. Then people started looking back at the 60s and saying, well, it wasn't so bad. Glasgow was always aware of pop history, and probably the best music made in Glasgow was made on the shoulders of the great pop music that went before. The first Glasgow boom, which was based around Postcard Records, it was a record label which was started by a guy called Alan Horn. It featured Aztec Camera, Joseph K, the Fire Engines, and the band that he promoted mostly were called Orange Juice. They merged punk aesthetics with kind of 60s country and western music, the music of the Byrds, to come up with this particular concoction. It seemed to be the most original thing that happens in Glasgow.
When I first saw you, something stirred within me. You were standing softly in the rain.
It definitely came out of, you know, punk. It was Glasgow's own particular take on punk, and it was effeminate. And, you know, try being an effeminate fey waster in 1979 Glasgow. That's pretty daring, you know.
Orange Juice, like, Their first gig, they were all wearing the school uniforms, which we all thought it was really cool, and it might have seemed a bit twee to some people, but the way they played, they weren't doing what people were doing then. People think of punk and they think thrash, noise, and like the Buzzcocks were completely pop, you know, and Orange Juice were pop, Strawberry Switchblade were pop. I think a lot of the best things that came out of punk were pop.
I think what was significant about them was that they were successful and they had a very particular aesthetic. You know, the significance of the Velvet Underground, mixing up these kind of very sort of punk gestures with the songcraft of like the Shangri-Las or Phil Spector.
Well, this is the very first thing that came out in Postcard, the first Orange Juice single, and then the second single that came out was Joseph K, and there was an Orange Juice single at the same time. I think there's a poster sleeve which has got the Orange Juice design on one side and then the Joseph K one on the other. They kind of diligently hand-coloured them all.
They were really clear about what they were influenced by and what they were kind of drawing attention to. And I think a whole palette, almost like a kind of catalogue of what would become the kind of basis of things that people were influenced by, came out of the Postcard records. You know, it was very French movies, Truffaut and that kind of thing, a lot of kind of 60s pop references. This DIY sort of punk aesthetic is very much in tune with what Splash One was. And I think that almost set like a really primitive template for BMX Bandits and Pastels and Primal Scream and people who came after that.
Orange Juice was this kind of really brief moment in Glasgow, and they were the first really modern group. You know, it was something different. But they moved to London quite quickly into their career, and then in Glasgow it was strange. It was like there was something missing.
Glasgow did feel quite a dark and depressed and angry city, I think, in the early to mid 1980s. Definitely, if you dared to be different, you really were setting yourself up as a target.
Just close your eyes and then remember the thoughts you've locked away.
I think it was a bit of a culture shock for a lot of people, punk was, but Glasgow's a much smaller community, probably not anywhere near as open-minded as people who lived in London. All the bikers hated the punks, all the Neds hated the punks, everybody hated the punks. I think they just thought it was a threat to their manliness or something, you know, like, I guess we were just an easy target. Yeah, it was a really hard place, but music saved my life. It might sound a wee bit dramatic to some people, but punk gave me this bravado that I didn't have before.
There were punks at our kind of high school and they would sort of be almost ostracised. And although I didn't wholeheartedly sign up to that kind of punk thing, I sort of actually quite liked the fact that these people were being defiantly different. Of course, eventually it became lots of people were being defiantly different in exactly the same ways. I think it inspired me to do things like turn up at Smoker's Corner wearing a Sherlock Holmes hat and smoking a pipe, start wearing nail polish, and if they ask my name, I'll tell them my name's Nancy. I still, you know, walk about Bellshill and occasionally people from that time in the past will go, "All right, Nancy, how you doing, big man?"
So I see a party track, like watch this, come here, sit, 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 stay, stay, go. You'd see somebody walking down the street that was dressed in a certain way, you'd kind of think, oh, they're into that kind of music, or that kind of thing. I suppose when you're 14, 15, you start noticing what kind of people are on the same wavelength as you. And I was lucky that I became best friends with two guys, Norman Blake and Douglas Stewart, and we would sit around each other's bedrooms, play each other's record collections, and I mean, God, there was so many bands we had back then. There was one we had that we invented the name of a band. We wanted to play at my school. We called the band the Child Molesters so that we could get banned. But they didn't, they let us play. All I remember is a song that Douglas sang that we did called I Got a Little Biscuit Tin to Keep Your Panties In. When the Jesus and Mary Chain came out, you know, that changed things.
I certainly felt Glasgow had more interest in noisier aspects of like American music, like the scene we were coming out of in New York, and then the bands that were coming out of Seattle, like Mudhoney and Nirvana. And it seemed more sort of hard-bitten up there than I felt like London was. And in a way, it didn't really want to sort of compete or even deal with the celebrity that London had, you know. That was relative to a lot of the smaller sort of regional areas of America, like Seattle, saying like, well, we don't need New York. And that was like that was a certain mindset.
Then when they started getting like a lot of press in London when they were playing like the gig where there was the riots and all that stuff, you know, to us it was kind of like our Sex Pistols, you know, for our generation. It was like a big awakening call for a lot of people. And that kind of made it seem believable as well that somebody that great lived up the road.
Everyone used to drink the Griffin, and I remember actually one night, probably after a Soup Drang's rehearsal, Sean saying, "Oh, there's Bobby Gillespie out of Primal Scream." He's like, "I'm going to ask him, see if we can get a gig or something." All right then. And Sean goes over and is like, comes back, "You've got a gig supporting him at Splash One, you know." "Oh, brilliant, aye. When's that?" "Aye, Sunday." "Oh, fuck, okay. Better get back to rehearsing, you know." I think that was only Primal Scream's second or third gig. But this one, this Primal Scream gig, this was Lucifer's Jamaica Street, which is a sub club, but before it was called the Sub Club. I don't know, I mean, they're all must have been like months apart, but these two probably, actually when you look at it, it looks like they might have been printed by the same person as well, you know. But it's funny, they had such a vibe, because although that one, for example, nice poster, pastels, membranes, but it's not got quite the same, this sort of one colour kind of Splash One thing. In reality, you know, the whole punk thing really, from a London point of view, everyone says, oh, by 78, 79 it was all over, you know. But actually, if you're in Scotland, it was just kind of starting then. I think by then, like 5 years later, when all this was going, it was sort of moved on from that, but I think it took that long for that sort of punk feeling of doing it yourself and just, you know, if there were no venues to play, you know, found this, the guys that organised Splash One found this Daddy Warbucks place, which is a horrible kind of club, you know. But to me, it felt like it was your thing, you know. I think as much as all the people who went to Splash One, so many of them started bands and started developing stuff. For me, the whole art thing sort of came out of that as well. And there was a Turner Prize nominees, winners, all the rest of it, all from Glasgow, you know, who were all part of that energy and a kind of real emotional connection at that point.
The Griffin was the pub of choice for young musicians and artists. They were sort of outsiders, not the mainstream. And it was pretty much really an old ladies pub. But then there would be these like people with striped t-shirts and like anoraks and screen printed kind of clothes and stuff like that kind of coming along. And so yeah, before the Splash One night started, very often we would congregate here. I think they used to, you could get a pie, like a Scotch pie, that was, or maybe some sausage rolls. That was as far as food would go. But I preferred the crisps. Like a lot of scenes, people on the outside assume it's a sort of clique and it's a bit exclusive, but I don't think it ever was that way. For me and Norman and Sean, we were a group of outsiders from a small town, and we came in here and we didn't really know anybody, but we started to talk about records with people like Bobby Gillespie and Stephen Pastel, and were very much welcomed in. And it was like, do you want to play at club? You know? And then we met people like Francis McKee and Eugene Kelly, and became friends with them, and it was like they also understand, and they're from the East End of Glasgow, and also be that kind of minority.
Swing, swing, up and down, turn, turn, turn around, round, 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 and back and over again. I think Splash One and the Griffin Bar were really important, just kind of to meet people and, you know, start to find out there's people doing the same things as you. The first night of that club I heard Some Velvet Morning, the Nancy Sinatra Lee Hazelwood song, for the very first time, and Francis was dancing to it, and it was at the end of the night. And I just remember thinking, what is this song? And I had to find out what it was. The DJs were using cassettes, they weren't even playing records, so you had to go up and ask them, what was that? I really remember you walked in and you saw two guys dancing together, or you saw two women dance together, but that was an unusual thing for me at the time. You just saw, you grabbed your pal up to dance, and you didn't think you have to go and ask, can I ask you to dance? But in that kind of old formal way, it was just more or less dance.
And there's a certain naivety to it as well, because if you wanted to be a musician or an artist, you were laughed at. You were just like, who do you think you are? On one hand, you had this kind of boundary, but then on the other, you felt, well, I can actually do whatever I want.
Yes, you love it, 'cause you do. She's always somehow coming through.
The whole atmosphere and scene allowed for women to play as, you know, an equal part as guys, which was radical, because, you know, before that, what was it? You know, the 70s was lad rock, pub rock. So it was definitely punk that opened the doors to all that stuff, to, you know, to independent, the indie scene, whatever you want to call it, the whole thing that ran through Glasgow.
There were lots of girls in bands who were really kind of comfortable in that scene, and maybe not quite so comfortable in the very kind of laddish Britpop revolution that came afterwards. It really didn't have the androgynous kind of like mix the sort of that you had in bands like the Pastels and the Vaselines, and you didn't get the idea that there was like a male frontman and then just a lot of people behind him.
That's a connection that Glasgow really has with something like Olympia, Seattle, where gender inequality is not even like really considered, because there's a certain acceptance of everybody, regardless of gender, being, you know, valid players in the scene. It was really important to sort of see bands coming out of Seattle like Bikini Kill, well, successfully kind of just sort of re-engaged and recaptured this idea of just like what punk rock was, and certainly Kurt was really important to that too, you know. And I think there was an affinity with what was going on in Glasgow with that vibe as well.
Boys became girls and girls became boys, and it was kind of beautiful. There was always the thing of, no, it was about a time and a place. And Splash couldn't really be recreated, because it was about those 8 people. At that time, they needed to sort of come together, as we needed it to sort of exist and come together in this place and at this time. But then there came a time where we didn't need it anymore.
It just got progressively busier and busier and busier, because you started getting written up in places, you know, fanzines were talking about it, and it just kind of started to get a bit uncomfortable, because it was that nice kind of family quality started getting lost. And I think, you know, they did the greatest thing that anybody can do is, well, it's doing really well.
In the end, you ended up with actual queues. It became almost like a proper club, and that wasn't what it was meant to be. And so I guess that was when the people involved were like, okay, let's leave it now.
The thing about Splash One is that, like a lot of mythologies, it creates a space for people to imagine what happened. Not really knowing what the details of the night are not strictly important. To add into what the actuality of it is, and that's where the kind of creative part comes out, because you create something that's part fact and part kind of invention. So you begin to create actually something that's new, but the departure point is the seed that thing is kind of like left in your head. You're yearning for something that you don't know anything about in a way, because there's a certain kind of romantic energy about that.
This is George Square, which I guess is a sort of central point in Glasgow. This is roughly where the Splash One happenings happened. It was just round about where this free house is. That could be a slightly mistaken memory. It looked completely different. I don't even really know exactly where it happened.
After Splash stopped, there were a lot of quite similar nights. They definitely had a legacy.
That amount of music that was kind of gathered gave like a basis of knowledge for the Glasgow scene that really kind of underwrites how diverse it is today. There's so many like super enthusiastic people, and they're part of a scene that's become really open about music.
I mean, this is going to seem like I'm a very unreliable witness, but I'm now actually thinking it could have been where McCall's was.
But it's the conceit of every generation that they think like nothing happened before them, you know. But I mean, it did seem like that was the start of something that's still going on today, you know. And I think that's made for a really rich scene in the city, in art and in music.
I don't know. 46 West George Street. That's ringing a bell, which means it's even more that way.
All the people I knew that kind of came from that scene, that were in bands making music, are still to this day, 30 years later, we're all still making music in some way or another. Just shows you that there was a lot of like-minded people in that club at the same time, and very rarely that happens within scenes.
I don't think any of us who came through that time and went to Splash One don't continue to be affected and influenced by those times, you know. We all would support group for each other, and then they got to a point where we didn't really need that support group anymore. But the stuff that they got from those years still stayed with them. This is it. Now it's all coming back to me. I can definitively say that this is where Splash One happenings happened. Didn't look like this. There was no flaming torches then, no big grand windows, but this is where it happened, on the ground floor of this very building.
Some